to the sister and brother for the next panel. This is not the end of the discussion. This is the middle of the beginning. We've been involved in this at the center, and what we want to do now is to give you some idea of how much you can win. I was peripherally involved in the Mangrove trial, where 9 people were done for conspiracy and 9 people got off.
Yes.
I was the witness of the sister to my left, Altheia Jones-LeCointe, Dr. Altheia Jones-LeCointe. The whole court stood up for one day when she received her doctorate. She defended herself, and to her left is Macdonald QC, who was the barrister for one of the other defendants, and I give the platform to them. It is particularly nice for me on the 40th anniversary of the Wages for Housework campaign to have my 2 mates from before the campaign who helped to educate me.
Well, I'm not 81. The Mangrove trial was a massive event, both in terms of the government's attempt to arrest the leadership of the Black Panther movement in Britain, and in the way in which we all almost destroyed the power, the traditional power of the court in the Old Bailey. During the course of the trial, initially 2 of the defendants, Altheia and Darcus Howe, decided to represent themselves. Later a 3rd joined them when he got fed up with his street lawyer, as Mumia would call them. And the importance of 2 people representing themselves was, first of all, they could tell it as it is. Secondly, there was no mediation of their lives and experiences through street lawyers, and I'm a street lawyer. And thirdly, to take the strength of the movement into the court. And one of the important features, not only of the Mangrove trial, but the later trials, which Michael was talking about with the Black Parents and Black Youth movement, was that every single day outside that court there were pickets, outside the Old Bailey, circulating round, and every day the public gallery was full of supporters. My task as one of the lawyers represented Barbara Beese, my task was really to make sure that neither the judge nor the prosecution could drive a wedge between the defendants in person and those represented by us street lawyers. The next thing that was important in order to get a proper fair trial was our attempt to get an all-black jury, and part of that task was allotted to me, God knows why, but it was. But I happened to have been teaching before with someone who had read medieval English at university, and he told me that in the Middle Temple there were a whole lot of they're called pleas of the rolls, which went back before the 11th century. And we went and inspected them, and they were all in medieval Latin shorthand. So, I mean, we thought, well, that's the end of that one. And then I discovered some guy who was a barrister, who was a far-right Tory, but he'd studied for the priesthood in Rome. And he knew medieval shorthand Latin. And he'd been waiting 40 years for someone to ask him to make use of it. And so he translated all these bloody documents, and they were wonderful because they were all about Welsh marchers could have juries of Welsh marchers, and Italian merchants could have a jury of the half-tongue, half Italians and half English, and all this kind of stuff. And so we were in front of this judge who was a bully. So when I got up to do this, he was kind of almost poo-pooing me and saying, sit down and shut up, before I'd even started. So what I would do, because I thought he was being out of order, so what I used to do was I'd go through 3 or 4 of these reports, and we had translations, and I'd then hand them up the shorthand Latin version and say, well, I'm sure your lordship knows how to read it, and I won't bother with the translation. At which point he went blue in the face. And so we got there. Anyhow, at the end of the first day, he said, Mr. Macdonald, this is hopeless. You haven't even got to Magna Carta yet. So anyhow, the next morning we got to Magna Carta. Peers, you're only to be tried by a jury of your peers. And we were trying to get a proper jury of peers in the true sense of the word. And I remember at the time, there was a little report of an East End wide boy who was charged at Lewis Assizes. And he stood up and he said, I don't want this Sussex jury. He said, they're as green as cabbages. Give me a Cockney jury and I'll be happy. So, anyhow, we didn't succeed in that. But one of the things that we did do was in those days you could pay a shilling and you got the whole of the jurors who were going to come to court. And we sat down, was it 2 or 3 days before the trial we had this, we paid our shilling and we got all the jurors and it showed their occupations. And we went through with scoring people out as unsuitable and all the rest of it. I can't remember what criteria we used, but anyhow, we went into court and we started, in those days again, you had peremptory challenges. Each person had 7 peremptory challenges, so 7, 9 makes 63, have I got it right? 63 peremptory challenges. And then there was a sort of slight loss of confidence amongst the people in the dock about whether this was going to work. And I think it was Roden Gordon who said, oh look, let's forget about it. We'll just take what jury we get. So that was important. Now during the trial, the judge behaved like a bully, and of course everyone stood up to him, and particularly the 2 who were representing themselves, Altheia and Darkus. And on one occasion, I just remember my task was to, if he started doing something to them, that I would get up and object. And on one occasion, he ordered the dock officers to take Darkus downstairs because he was making a nuisance of himself. And I got up and I said, you can't do that. It's racist. And you're behaving in a way which no judge ought to behave in. And at which point the public gallery started clapping and cheering. And fortunately, this guy also had a little bit of a sense of humour. And he said, all right, Mr. Macdonald, you've now got your applause. Why don't you shut up and sit down? And Mr. Howe, will you come and take your seat, please? So that was the whole thing that happened. Speeches were made. I got into a lot of trouble afterwards, well, nearly, because I made a speech about judicial tyranny. And I said,
Definitely a brave man.
And I said, members of the jury, this is not Russia, this is not the court of the Star Chamber, but we have had examples of judicial tyranny in this court which are more suited to those places than to the Old Bailey. For some reason unprecedented, he had a tape recorder and a shorthand writer in court at that point. They're never there normally for closing speeches. I think they were actually put in there because Roden Gordon was going to make a speech which he had no idea, nor did anyone else, about what he was likely to say. But anyhow, afterwards we went and had a celebration dinner at the Mangrove restaurant, which was then published in the local paper. And I was initially charged with 2 offences by the Bar Council. One was having dinner with Vanessa Redgrave and members of the jury, and the second one was my judicial tyranny speech. Well, fortunately, the whole of the organisation of the Panthers was quite prepared to come and picket, and at the time I was also had been very involved in a GLC rent strike, in which a lot of the leadership of that worked in Covent Garden Market, which was at that time a market, flowers and vegetables and all the rest of it, not what it is now. And they said, well, that's all right, Ian, we usually finish work about 9:30, we'll come and picket if anything happens to you. So I got the Black Panther movement, and I got the Shop Stewards Committee at Covent Garden Meat Market to come down. And I think word of that must have got round, because I was eventually told that all proceedings were going to drop, and I was then told that I had to appear before the treasurer of my inn, who's the sort of big honcho in the Middle Temple. And so I went in there ready to do battle, and this rather wise little man, he's called Lord Salmon, not Lord Salmon of Fishgate, but Lord Salmon of, and he was a very eminent judge, and he looked at me and he said, "Macdonald," so I thought, here we go, and he said, "It's terribly important that members of the bar stand up to the judiciary." So I thought to myself, hang on a second, I'm in the wrong place. But he said, very quietly, he said, "But I don't think I would have done it the way you did."
To celebrate the birth of my second granddaughter, my second grandchild, and actually my daughter. Yeah, my daughter Nandi, who just had the baby on the 11th of April, was actually in my belly when I was at the Old Bailey. So I just want to thank her for her patience. I find it very difficult to rise to this challenge. I always like to generalize and draw on our history to deal with the present. And in the last 500 years, African people in the Caribbean have been wandering around the world. More than 60% of Barbadian men went to build the Panama Canal. And Barbados is a small country, and that holds true of Caribbean men from all the Caribbean islands. Then many people from all over the Caribbean, including the place that my husband is from, Dominica, went to Aruba and Curacao to work in the oil refineries. And they couldn't take wives because they didn't want children to be born Dutch. And they therefore couldn't take their wives. But if a wife came, or if a girlfriend came and got pregnant, they had to take the child back to the Dominica or St. Vincent or wherever so that they wouldn't have residential rights. then there's the migration, the internal migration that took place during slavery. Well, not migration so much, but as forced removals during slavery. A lot of the people who fought in the Haitian Revolution were deported to other islands in the Caribbean. And my husband Eddie always claims that he's one of them. And in that regard, when I talk about being one of them, I just recognize that we are a continuation of the spirits of those people who fought at that time. So I don't make any distinction between myself and my ancestors. So, so a lot of Caribbean people have been moved around this region. I have a friend, Carlos Moore, who is Cuban, and his parents migrated from Jamaica to Cuba to cut sugar cane. And then he discovered when he came to Trinidad that his father really wasn't his father, but his father was a Trinidadian man called Wedderburn. And the man who he thought was his father was in fact somebody who rescued his mother. So the stories of our fragmentation are legion. And it is this struggle actually which makes us whole.
No.
It is the struggle that makes us whole. And I'm saying that because it was my life experience, really. In the struggle, we come to find out who we are and who we are not. And I remember the first day I came to England as a student, a chemistry student at University College, and they were welcoming the new students in the Ramsey reading room, and they called Altheia Jones, and I went in, and they all looked a bit aghast, and one of them had the presence of mind to say, "Are you sure you're in the right place?" And I learned at that point who I was not. And I went on to do a PhD in University College, and my professor heard that I was giving leaflets out to protest against the presence of Enoch Powell coming to the college. And he called me in and he said, in his very British way, "Altheia, you will get a PhD if you want one." In other words, he'd washed his hands of me. Because we had a discussion and he was saying that, Enoch Powell was kind of right because there were too many immigrants into Britain, and I said, "But what about Australia? And there are British, English immigrants in Australia and stuff." Then he went on to say that the Portuguese did all the Knox sculptures. He said there was no civilization in Africa, and I said, "Well, what about the Knox sculptures in the British Museum?" Then he said, "Oh, some people think the Portuguese did that out there." So I learned another lesson of who I was not. And we had a demonstration outside the ULU Students' Union against the racism in the Students' Union. They used to keep two lists, one for landlords who would take black people and one for landlords and landladies who would not. And we had a sit-in in the ULU against that policy, and we said if landlords and landladies didn't take black people, they shouldn't be on the ULU list. And the Black Panther movement came to the ULU demonstration to support us. And that's when I met Eddie, and 40 years later, we're still battling it out. And in 1973, when Nandi was 1 year old, we decided to go to Trinidad. My parents hadn't seen their grandchild. When we got into Trinidad, we were put in a separate room. We weren't allowed to leave immigration. We were put in a separate room, and then they started turning over the milk, digging up in the baby clothes. There was a man throwing bullets up in the air, and so we didn't have a clue what this was all about. And when we were finally released because they didn't find the arms and ammunition they were looking for, we came into the situation where my sisters had been fighting against the government. The following day, Beverly was brought down dead from the hills, and we were just there in time for her funeral. And the night of the week when people come to the house, we were there talking with people who had come to visit, and Eddie was introduced to the people in the house because it was the first time he had met my father, and blah, blah, blah. And one of my father's friends said to him, "LeCointe, I know a man on the port called LeCointe." And Eddie said, "But my father is in Trinidad and that could be him." And so he met the man the next day, and yes, indeed, it was his father. So what I'm saying, all this to say, is that in that movement of people from all over, over this long period of time, there has been an enormous amount of fragmentation of the lives of Caribbean people. And people land up being all over the place and not knowing who their relatives are, and not being connected to the group that we should be. And in the struggle, we make ourselves whole. We reconnect in a way that is really quite fantastic. And where the mangrove comes into it, where the mangrove trial and its connections come into it, is that we were part of the Black Panther movement. I don't know how suddenly I've become a leader. We didn't recognize those categories. Yes, that's what you say, but we didn't recognize those categories. We believed in collective leadership. We believed that we should have discussions about things and come to conclusions about things. And we recognized that in isolating leaders, we became vulnerable to the machinations of the press, the media, and so on and so forth. So we were very conscious of the need to cultivate a collective leadership. And I remember during the Mangrove trial, for example, when we had all those demonstrations outside the court in support of the people inside the court, one of the tactics of the police, and has always been, was to arrest the men. And we went back to the drawing board when so many people were getting arrested during that trial, and we agreed to have only women on the demonstration the next time. There was a big fight about that. The men felt that we wouldn't be protected. So anyway, we did eventually agree to have the women-only demonstration. And when the police saw, they were coming in for the kill, as it were, and then one of the police officers said, "Oh God, there's a bunch of women." And no arrests were made that day and subsequently. I also want to make 2 points about the unity and the fragmentation, because we shouldn't glossify our history. During the Mangrove trial, there were 9 of us, and of course there's all kinds of struggles going on inside of it. I was approached by a representative of our embassy, and the line was, "You're a nice girl, you came up here as a student and you were led astray by these bad people." And that didn't quite work. Then inside of the then inside of the actual Old Bailey itself, we had our own battles because Frank Critchlow, who is a charming, delightful, gentle person, but a bit vulnerable in some ways, had a barrister who said to him, but you're a decent restaurateur who was led astray by these Black Power people. And therefore, what our defense should be that we should move away from this collective, struggle that you all are putting on in the court, and I will plead your case as, as somebody who was a victim, really, of these bad leftist blacks. And I remember when Frank came to, so we saw Frank aside at lunchtime talking to the man, I wouldn't call his name. And he's dead, all right, Croft. Yeah, okay. And we didn't know why Frank should be aside because we usually had group meetings. And then Frank came and said, well, Croft thinks we should do the case this way. And I was very aggressive at that time. And I sort of laid into Frank and he started to cry. And those were really, challenging moments for us during the case. What I want to say to the...
Can I interrupt?
Yes.
This barrister Croft, he was about 6'6", and we had a great big room cell underneath the Old Bailey where we all met. And on that particular occasion, Altheia took her shoe off and bashed him over the head.
I don't remember that.
Okay, go on.
Yeah, okay, so I'm just going to wind up. I just want to say to the mum who just spoke about the grief that I felt when she was talking, and all the mothers who talked today. I just want to say that we have discovered and rediscovered the ways in which we could overcome the fragmentation that is our history. And the way is through joining the struggle, being part of an organized struggle. In some way, find a way to be part of an organized struggle.
Hear, hear. Hear, hear.
And that is what we have been trying over all our lives to establish in wherever we've lived, to let people be aware that it is an organized struggle that is going to heal that fragmentation that is really such a deep-rooted part of our history. Thank you.